both to continue the conversation. All right, so good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. My name is Jill Remick. So I'm the director of a division called Property Valuation and Review at the Tax Department. We're right there, which is very handy. So largely what our division does, just for a really high level, we do basically everything working directly with municipalities related to the statewide education property tax. So we are in regular, frequent daily contact with listers, assessors, town clerks, and treasurers. We support them with everything from appraising different properties, reappraisals, current use program, homestead, exemptions, tax increment financing. We manage the pilot program. So there's a whole lot of information just about what we do. So current use is one component of that piece. So our role is really to administer the program. We don't, we're agnostic as far as sort of policy decisions. I think I'm sure you are planning to hear from like Forest Parks and Recreation and Agency of Agriculture, because they have a lot more great information about the impacts of the program and enrollees. And so we're really just like, we're the administrators of the program. So the main components that we administer are we're working every day with landowners, consulting foresters, the county foresters and the Forest Parks and Recreation, to manage enrollment. So that's a combination of processing new enrollments or applications or transfers. There's a lot of transfers, or, splitting parcels and combining them with another enrolled group. Doing mapping updates, right? A lot of it is about maintaining maps and making sure we have accurate mapping, because part of the program is there's a lien on the property it's sold. So I'll go through that. And then we also administer the land use change tax, which is the penalty when you remove land from the program or it becomes developed. So we'll walk through those pieces as well. And again, I'm happy to answer any questions as we go. I definitely will be listening in this afternoon too. And I did see Ezra's presentation last week for Ways and Means. So some of this you might hear it twice, but I think it's probably just as well, because I still learn new things about current use every day, and I've been the director for 8 years old. So this is spelled out in Title 32, Chapter 1 to 24. It hasn't changed a whole lot, but it has evolved over time when it was first put in place in the 80s, I believe. It's really about maintaining productive ag and forest land. So this is like a working lands program, and to also sort of maintain and protect natural habitat, forestry, working agricultural lands from parcelization and development. So it's designed, right, to maintain agriculture and forest land. So we work directly with farmers for agriculture enrollment. There are very specific parameters for what qualifies both as the property itself and as an enrollee. Again, definitely we'll want to have you folks hear from Forest Parks and Recreation about the forest management. There's a whole component of that work. There's several people at Forest Parks and Recreation who oversee the forest aspect of current use. So there's forest management plans. There's forest management activity reports. They have a much more sort of in-depth review of an oversight over the forest land. It's also meant obviously to conserve and preserve land for like future productive use, make sure we're protecting those natural ecological systems in Vermont. It's definitely designed to prevent sort of encroachment on some of these natural habitats, forestry and agriculture for development. It's also clearly, just to be clear, it's a property tax benefit program. So it reduces property tax liability for parcels that are in the program. So it is absolutely meant to sort of encourage folks to continue to have the land meeting the requirements of the program. And in exchange for that, there's a significant property tax reduction for them. Obviously, right, so Vermont is kind of unique that we think we're unique, I suppose, in preserving sort of our scenic landscape and our agriculture and forest. Because when you leave Vermont and you immediately see billboards and things like that, it does feel very different, and one of the things that makes Vermont a lovely place to be. And also to sort of help citizens plan for orderly growth. So there are definitely conversations happening in this building. I think it happens every year. How can we sort of balance current use enrollment and protection of these lands with our need for housing and development where it's appropriate and thoughtfully planned out? So I have a feeling that we'll be back in to continue to talk through that. So just for some context, right? So right now we have a little over 19,600 parcels in the program. So that's not necessarily unique taxpayers, right? So a lot of folks might have multiple parcels in the program. So there's about 16,000 unique owners or landowners in the program. And as you can see, clearly, right, a significant majority is forest land. Again, I don't have any cool maps or anything like that, but FPR has some fantastic illustrations of where current use land and forest land is located in Vermont. I hope to come back here with that someday, but you can see and it makes sense, right? So you have huge swaths of forest land that are enrolled in the program. And then agriculture acreage, not necessarily entirely, but are often smaller parcels, different parts of the state. But the total enrollment is about a third of Vermont's total land cover is enrolled in the program.
Total land.
Right, so out of the total number of acres in Vermont, about a third of that literal acreage is enrolled. And this is I think on your committee page, and I also, I brought this in as well. It's also on your legislative report page. So we have like a larger property valuation and review annual report. I can send the link over to you folks as well. Like I said, it's on the legislative webpage. But this is kind of a big picture overall of everything property valuation review does. There's also like current use, enrollment and tax savings by town, and a lot of good stuff in here. I will.
That's the property.
Yeah, so it's the property valuation review annual report. I'll send that to Sedona when I get back to my desk and send it.
Yeah.
There's a whole lot of,
Property.
yeah. And I do have some printed copies. They're in high demand, but if you'd like some for this room, I'm happy to bring you some of that.
Is it different from the little, there's a small, I think, report that comes out every year?
I don't know, as long as I've been
Okay,
here.
think of something else then.
It's been this guy. We have cut back on trying to save paper, not making as many copies and putting some of the larger data tables on our website.
Yeah.
But when I came in last year with very few copies, I did end up having to make copies. And I find it really handy to mark up and actually write. But it is also a PDF. So I'll send that over when I get back. Apologies, I should have brought that over with me.
Representative O'Brien.
Thank you, Chair. Jill, just out of data interest, that one third of Vermont land are enrolled in current use. Have you ever seen the statistic for what that number would be for potentially we could enroll? Because we're not going to enroll state
Right.
forests or national forests or Lake Champlain, so
Right.
is it somewhere like over half?
Actually, maybe this is Ezra's slide and not mine. Or it's in here. We're kind of topping out, right? There's only so many acres that can be enrolled in the program. So you can kind of see, sorry, I was looking for a chart that we have in here that's kind of there's sort of a climb of enrollment of both kinds of acreage over time, and now it's kind of leveled out. So what we're seeing now is you can sort of see the acreage, the total acreage is kind of not flatlining really, but leveling out. But there are more pieces enrolled, so people might be splitting it, but it's still qualified and can stay in the program. I think FPR, especially a couple years ago, they were doing the research into the reserved forest land category, which is now an eligible property type that can be enrolled under the forest category. And so they were able to identify like potential candidates for that. But beyond that, I think, we've kind of identified who can be in there, what qualifies. So I don't see it like being able to expand a whole lot. And there's also several years ago, the legislature added a ecologically sensitive treatment area. So there are definitely like wetlands and things like that are also eligible to be enrolled and protected. So yeah, I think we've got
Right, because all
pretty
those
good
parcels under 25 acres couldn't be eligible anyway, right?
Well, they can under certain circumstances, for certain qualified farmers, you can enroll under 25 acres, yeah.
I seem to remember that from a previous conversation that of the eligible forest land, roughly half is enrolled. So to your question, I mean, that wouldn't include federal land or state land, but of the private land that could be enrolled in the forestry part of the program. I'm not sure about ag.
Right.
But I seem to remember that. Anyway, we will, as Jill has said, we should have, and we'll have both the ag agency later this week is coming in, and then we'll have the FPR in as well to go into the details.
Yeah, and we are starting to see some reserved forest land enrollment that we were wondering if it would be folks that were enrolled in the active forest existing and we're gonna convert it to reserve forest land, or if they'd be new. There's a combination of both, but we are now seeing some applications for that reserve forest land category that were not in the program before.
Representative Morgan.
I may have missed it, but are town lands, town forests qualified for such things?
They're already exempt, so they wouldn't have any need to put it into the program. If if a town owns property in another town, which does happen sometimes where counties own properties in other counties, then they would maybe want to do that, but within their town boundaries, they're tax exempt.
Representative Lipsky.
Thank you. There have been some recent conversions from current use to sort of a carbon market from large parcels. Do the carbon market properties stay in current use?
I don't know that we've captured that. We have a lot going into conservation easements, which might be under that bubble, but we don't capture the carbon market, like sort of, we don't have
You
that
aren't tracking
information.
that.
We're not tracking that.
Thank you, Chairman. If land is sold into land trust, does that still require it to be in current use, or because the development rights have been sold to land trust, it would no longer have to remain in current use?
We see several dozen a year that that do have either easements or have in some, sort of in fee simple have gone to the land trust, and they remain in the program. That is an eligible category, so they tend to stay in the program.
Okay, because if they didn't stay in the program and the development rights were peeled off of them, I don't see how they can be taxed at anything except for the residual ag or forestry value.
Right, so the lister could take that into account, right, and decide that it's fair market value. If it doesn't have development rights, would be reduced, and they would put it on the gram list at that lower value, and that's what they'd be paying taxes on. If they weren't in the program.
But they would still be eligible to
Yeah,
enroll,
if they meet the other eligibility categories, they certainly do. But yeah, I see a lot of those. I see a lot of properties now going to different land trusts and getting conservation easements on them, but staying in the program. All right, I'll keep rolling, but I feel like this is you guys probably know more than the average bear, so this might not be particularly interesting. So farm buildings are taxed at 0% fair market value. So there's really particular qualifications for what can be a farm building that's articulated in statute. That does include farm employee housing. After it's been used for a year as farm employee housing, it can be enrolled as a farm building as long as it's used for that. So we do still capture the value of the farm buildings, right? Because the whole idea is we are capturing the either education or municipal revenue that was not collected. And so we're able to sort of have our full gram list and be able to report out on what the values are. That might be different than what it's actually taxed on. So as you can imagine, right, there are farm buildings that are a run-in shed for sheep, and there are farm buildings that are, multi-million-dollar sugar operations and things like that. So there's a wide variety, but they are taxed at 0% fair market value if they qualify. And so that's about, there's about 1,700 parcels that have some farm buildings on them.
Representative Lipsky.
Thank you. We've had testimony in here from the equine community that their farm buildings are not considered agriculture, and they are, when they convert from cows to horses, they allow to us that their taxes go up exponentially, and it makes the equine industry or business much less viable. So on a parity issue, do you have thoughts to create parity there? Large consumers of field crops pay other fees.
Yeah, so our interpretation of the statute is that if they are using it for so it's the agriculture entities, they have to create a crop or create, an animal product. So if they are breeding horses, that is considered, a crop, an animal entity that's being produced. Whereas if it's riding horses, it's recreational and it's not. So that's how we've interpreted the statute. I mean, I'm a horse person, I have lots of personal opinions about what we should do, but that's how we've interpreted the statute, that's my understanding. And there are things like riding arenas and things like that that right now are considered development that would be considering taking out the program, but. Yeah, we have, I think legislative council and the tax department have done, I don't know if they're actually formal legislative reports, but there's certainly like research that's been done that I can try to dig up for everyone about that, because that does come up. Yeah.
Right.
Just while we're on farm buildings, accessory on farm businesses, buildings, are those eligible or not?
Not a dwelling, right? So if it's something that's used for like the production of the crop, then it can be. But if it's like a cabin that's someone staying there in the apple orchard, that's not really eligible. But if it's your farm stand that's selling the apples, that could theoretically be eligible, but it's a slippery slope.
A cabin that is rented out.
Exactly,
People, but a
sorry, yes.
cabin that was housing for
Yes, if it's a
farm workers would be in.
farm employee housing, then that would be eligible, and there are. That seems to be something we're hearing a lot, sort of anecdotally. Is obviously the housing market is also impacting farm employee housing, and so a lot of landowners are building or putting on dwellings so that they have a place for their farm employees to live. Right, so coming at this from the taxation perspective, so every year we collect the information about what property tax revenues were impacted by current use enrollment. We collect the municipal property tax rates, right? So there's the statewide education property tax rates, and then there's your local municipal tax rate. So we collect that information by parcel and we pay out annually to the municipalities what we call the hold harmless payment. It's paid out of the general fund. It's basically to sort of make municipalities whole. My understanding as part of this was, it used to be right before we had a statewide education property tax system, that it might be a disincentive for a municipality to allow current use enrollment because they were going to be losing revenue. And so this way it keeps that, that parity. It doesn't have a negative impact on a municipality if they have local property enrolled in the program. So we do make that payment annually to the municipalities. And then also we do collect the foregone education tax revenue. So this is just simply that calculation, the delta between if the property was not enrolled in the program and was being taxed at full fair market value on the grant list versus the tax revenue collected for their current use enrollment. That's about 55 million. So that's about $76 million in foregone revenue, which has changed a lot. And I think a lot of that is not that we've had an explosion in enrollment, but our property values are going up. It's another one of those sort of symptoms of the property values increasing every year. So this is looking at that same data, but just sort of a longitudinal look at that, right? So we have the tax savings to landowners for the municipal tax and then the education tax and then the total. We have this further back than this even if we need that.
The municipal portion comes out of the general fund. That's the amount that's now 20 million. And the education tax is the state piece of it. It comes out of the education fund. That's the 55 million.
In a way, so what it does is it redistributes that liability to the ed fund, and then it's part of the statewide education property tax.
Right, so it's tax savings to enrolled landowners, but if we want to think of it that way, we should also think of it as an increased tax on everybody else who's not enrolled that owns property. That's a yes?
Yes.
Okay.
It's
Just
a
wanna
very.
make sure that-
it's-
Yes, I
Sort of
know
from
that
a
no one
perspective, yes.
wants to think of it that way, but I think that if we are going to talk about it as a savings here,
Right.
it's.
It is education revenue that was not collected, and therefore, because the education fund is a closed loop, it's gotta be made up.
Zero sum.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Sorry to be challenging. Right, so again, current use is not like a lot of the other administrative processes in the tax department where an individual or a business files a return, we review that return, okay, on we go. Current use involves obviously landowners, right? Several thousand landowners every year are enrolling, transferring, making changes. And so we're in regular contact with them. The consulting foresters are private foresters who are recommended and by FPR and are working directly with landowners to manage their forest land. So they play a really important role in making sure that folks are following the parameters of the program, maintaining their maps, tracking their activity, if they have activity, making sure they're following their forest management plan. And so the consulting foresters work closely with the county foresters at FPR. So Forest Parks and Rec actually has county foresters who oversee, in addition to current use, I think there's probably other things they do as well, but they are kind of one of the main conduits, and they review all the current use enrollees and work with consulting foresters and landowners to make sure that they're eligible and meeting the requirements. Because current use involves a lot of lien management, and also there's a lot of property transactions that are involved. We also do often work with real estate attorneys. So if I haven't made it clear, so the way that current use works is when you are eligible and you enroll and you're approved, so you're in the program, a contingent lien is placed on the parcel and or buildings that are enrolled in the program. So that is basically the state's way of sort of saying, okay, we've got this contingent lien on this property. If and when it ever comes out of the program or is developed, then that's how we collect land use change tax. There's a lien on the property that's there until the land use change tax is paid. We changed it to a contingent lien versus just a straight up lien a few years ago because a lot of landowners were having challenges with mortgage companies like, whoa, I'm not going to give you a mortgage for this because you've got a lien on this property. So we had to do this whole like subordination process to like assure the lenders, especially some of the larger lenders, that we would wait our turn in line with the state. So it's a contingent lien now, meaning it doesn't become an active lien until it's developed or the land use change tax is not paid. But that means that there are some instances where maybe property has changed hands and there wasn't sort of due diligence on the title, and the lien follows the land until that is paid off. So I could hand this to you. Now it's yours. Now it's your lien that you have to pay the land use change tax to remove. So we have a team of 4 of us over at BDR who are the ones sort of doing all this day-to-day work. So they've got to be sort of experts in like deeds and trusts and LLCs and farm and how to do farm employee housing information, how to do income tax review for farmers to be eligible. They work regularly with landowners and the county foresters and the consulting foresters to sort of oversee this work throughout the year. There also is a current use advisory board. So the current use advisory board is a statutory board made up of a combination of folks like myself, a representative from Forest Parks and Recreation, Agency of Agriculture, and then we have appointees. So we have an individual representing municipal officials, individual representing the agriculture industry, an individual representing the forestry industry, and then assessment industry person. So it's kind of a neat group of state employees and folks who are in the program. There is a requirement that the current use advisory board has 50% of or less of the members have land in the program. So it doesn't become sort of only folks enrolled in the program make up the board. That's not how the board is made up. There are some folks on it, obviously, who are. And there's people like me who have third acre and affiliated one. Okay. So the current use advisory board, their 2 major duties are they set those use values every year. They're about to meet and do that February 12th. They do that using a pretty set calculation that Forest Parks and Recreation provide to them for forest land, and the Agency of Agriculture provide to them for agriculture land. So they set those use values every year. They also have administrative rules. So those are the rules that also sort of dictate the work that me and my staff do, building off the statute, because there's things that just have come up over time that need clarification. There's specific processes about like the application process and things like that. That the statute needs, the statute doesn't get to that level of granularity, but we need administrative rules to oversee that. So those are the sort of 2 main duties of the current use advisory board. Obviously, like I said, we work directly with listers and assessors and town clerks as well. So the listers and assessors have a few different roles. They're responsible for valuing the property that's enrolled. Obviously, they're always responsible for maintaining the grand list on all properties in Vermont, but they also have to value the property that's enrolled, the farm building values, things like that. They also are responsible if a portion of a parcel is being removed from the program, they are responsible for valuing that as a standalone parcel for the purposes of the land use change tax. So the listers and assessors definitely play an active role in overseeing this as well. And the clerks for recording and obviously lien releases, right? You release the lien once the land use change tax is paid.
Representative Brown.
Yeah, just quickly, Joe. In the financial world, because there's this fair market value for this property enrolled, and then there's, what it's being assessed at. do lending institutions only lend, collateral wise up to what it's at the use value level, or do they consider the whole property?
Yeah, I never heard that before. I think from their perspective, it's still the whole property, highest and best use, fair market value. Right, because that lien may or may not continue. Current use doesn't just necessarily follow the property. If it's an easement, things like that, that is when they do sort of factor that into how to
Right.
appraise the property. But yeah, I haven't heard that that's been treated differently.
Representative Nelson.
Having just received transfer, generational transfer in the property, they assess it somewhere in the middle. They don't necessarily give you credit when you're borrowing against it, the full-blown potential. They go somewhere from ag value to there, and meet somewhere in the middle.
It's good to know. All right, so just to give you a picture of where we're at right now, so this past year, we processed a little under 1,800 applications, which may not seem like a lot, but they're months-long processes involving maps. And we're seeing a whole lot of more complex property transactions because folks are putting land in or, parcels into trusts and LLCs, things like that, estates. So we've had to become, which is completely within their, right to do and make a lot of sense apparently for sort of like long-term planning. So a lot of the applications and transfers we're dealing with may not actually be at changing hands. It might be that they're moving it into a like estate or a trust. So out of those, only 277 were new enrollments. And some of those might have been in the program 10 years ago, and now they've been bought by someone who wants to put it back in, but that is not the major component of the work that we do. The vast majority are transfers of some kind. So it might be a transfer of the full property, or it might be a transfer of the partial property. And then that also means we need to, that there needs to be a decision about the remaining property, if it wants to stay in enrollment or if it's coming out as well. And the way that we capture this, obviously the responsibility is on the property owner to apply, keep us informed of any changes. And also when there is a transfer, they are required to let us know and submit a new, like if I purchased a property that's enrolled in the program, it's incumbent on me to submit a new application to continue enrollment. But the way we try to manage that, which I think is largely working pretty well, is because we're the tax department, we get all the property transfer tax returns into our system. So when someone's property transfer tax return comes into the program and they're asked, is the land in current use? Do you intend to continue? Depending on how they answer those questions, they get a letter from us saying, hey, great, you've purchased property in the program. In order to remain in the program, please submit an application. The statute, I think, is within 30 days. If you'd like to remove it from the program, then you need to submit what we call LV 314, so the land use change tax return, to withdraw it from the program. So that's kind of where the net we kind of use to try to catch as many of those as we can to let the landowners know, hey, you've just purchased property that's in the program. Some still may not answer those questions in the way that gets them the right letter, or we might, months down the road have the lister be like, hey, you still got this parcel enrolled under this name, but now it belongs to so-and-so. So we've got to kind of track that down. So that's why none of these things are just like easy transactions. There's a lot of research involved.
So they would be in limbo if they didn't respond one way or the other. I want to transfer, I want to enroll and stay enrolled, or no, I want to withdraw if they didn't do either.
If they didn't do either, we send them a couple of letters saying you really got to
Do
decide.
something.
And if not, if we don't hear from them, they will get a letter and we will start the process of withdrawing them. But we do tend to try to give them a letter and then a certified letter to make it really clear.
Representative,
Yeah. Thank you. In this committee, previous biennium, there was concern, and we worked on bills to allow the generational transfer of properties that were going to continue in agricultural use to be either exempt from some level of transfer tax, whether from grandparents to the next generation or the grandchildren, to keep the legacy of agricultural current use. Is there a transfer tax? Is there any
So there's a property transfer tax that's totally separate from current use that I'm not an expert at, but that there is a property
Right.
transfer tax that happens before, outside of current use if property changes hands. And I don't know, there might be an exemption for family members. I know that there's been like things like a settlement and divorce, that might be another exemption, but I don't want to speculate on that. But for current use, if it's transferred, and we get the application, and it's still eligible, then it continues without any penalty. But if it's not eligible, or if it's withdrawn, or if it's a portion of the parcel and it becomes a new parcel that's less than 5 acres, there's a lot of ways that that could still end up in land use change tax. But it depends on the specific situation and what is happening with the parcel after the transfer.
I just had one other question about this slide, Jill. On the ag side, I remember we made a change a few years ago. Is there not a requirement for property owners who are enrolled to do something every year? And
Yes.
you have to process, just thinking about, the work that you're doing.
Yes, so, right, so as this says, and as we've looked at by the, the number of enrollments and acreage, Forest Parks and Recreation is involved with the vast majority of review, right? The vast majority is forest land and requires forest management plan and goes through that county forester review. For ag only parcels, so parcels that are enrolled under agriculture, they are required to submit an annual agriculture certification. So every fall, we send out to all, I think it's about 7,000 we sent out this year, that they need to sign and send back to us and note any changes to the parcel, changes to the buildings, changes to the use, changes to ownership that maybe we haven't caught, and send that back to us so that we can, yes, they're still in compliance, or we need to follow up, right? If they have any changes, then that means our staff will follow up and try to find out more information, but they are required to submit that annually. And that's another one where we will send another letter shortly to the smaller number that we haven't heard from to say, hey, we sent this, we really need you to fill this out and get this back to us. And for folks that maybe just completely disregard all of that, and if we have any other like concerns, or the lister says, hey, they moved out of state, I don't know, like, then we have to kind of track that down. But there is that requirement for ag, but there's no, like, we don't do any sort of like site visits or anything like that. We do have a lot more tools with ortho and oblique imagery now, so you can kind of check out what's going on. We don't do that. We're not really a compliance audit. Gotcha. That's not our role, is we're trying to process these. But if we don't hear from someone, we've got to try to find out one way or the other if they're still eligible or not.
Representative O'Brien.
Because while we're on ag, how does cannabis growing fitting in this? current
There
use?
are very specific statutory constructs. There definitely are buildings and land that's enrolled that are for cannabis cultivation. As of a few years ago, there are requirements about whether it's indoor and outdoor and how many and what portion of their enrollment they are. That's another where we're not tracking to that specific level, right? So the Cannabis Control Board, I think, must have licenses, and so they would have like much more specific information, but it is a crop and there are specific eligibility categories they can have for their buildings, for the processing of it, the growing of it, and a certain square footage, I think, for enrollment. But my understanding is that has to be in addition to like another farm operation. It can't be.
But it's, as far as PBR is concerned, it is agriculture.
I'm looking for Mr. Brady to see if I can start out at all.
They previously had to be enrolled,
That's right. Yes.
so you don't get penalized, get kicked out of the program for that parcel. It's now a cannabis cultivation, so, but I'm gonna double check that.
Thank you. All right, so like I said, the current use of, sorry, I think I should reorder these a little bit. I'm kind of jumping all over. I apologize. So the current use advisory board, like we talked about, they have that sort of oversight with their administrative rules and they establish those use values. They meet every February to establish those new values. There is a really good explanation. We submitted a report. I think this committee might have been on there. It was Act 146 of 2022, which was the reserved forest land enrollment, also required us to come back with a report about any recommended changes to use value. So we did submit that report. I think it was due end of December, just this recent December. We did not make any recommendation to make any changes to use value. categories. Back in the eighties and I think maybe early nineties, there were multiple, far more use categories, and it's pretty tough to track and it's hard to administer and make it really fair. So there are 3 use values. So there's the agriculture use value. So this is a dollar per parcel figure that is set every year that replaces the property tax, the fair market value. And I have a slide, I think, that breaks that down, and I can articulate that as well. Forest land is a different use value, right? They're not the same value. And then there also is a third category for forest land that's greater than a mile from, can't remember if it's a class 3 or something like that road. Basically, so like it's not like it's accessible by a road. That has a slightly lower use value as well. So over the past several years, right? So we have the forest land per acre value, the forest land greater than a mile from a road, and then the agriculture value per parcel. And you can see how those have sort of ticked up over time. There is the formula that is used by FPR and agriculture that is recommended to the current use advisory board does have sort of a like averaged over time lag, so that it doesn't like swing significantly year to year. It can change over time. So in essence, if you have land enrolled in the program, then the acreage, that value is set by your lister, the value of the acreage that's enrolled in the program. And then say it's 10 acres, just for the sake of simplicity. So rather than paying the fair market value taxation of that property, this dollar figure is basically calculated as an exemption on that value. So you're paying a lower property tax bill for the enrolled acreage. All right. So why would you enroll? So obviously there can be very significant property tax savings. This can vary. There are a lot of reasons why this could be significant or not, depending on the particular situation and the land involved. But it does reduce the property tax liability. And can be significant and helpful, not only to property tax liability, but obviously, to try to continue to support property being used for our working lands. But so some folks do not enroll for all kinds of reasons. Obviously, the contingent lien is a significant one. It is at some point in the future, either the current owner or a future owner is going to have to pay the land use change tax, or there is going to continue to be this contingent lien on the property. The lien literally follows the land in perpetuity. So we have rooms and rooms of file cabinets because we have tracked the parcel versions over decades, because that land use change tax may not have been paid on a parcel from back in the 80s and someone just bought it. We've got the records to show the map that has followed that land over time. There are costs to prepare the application materials and do the updates. I'm assuming that I think this is the cost is a little bit more for forest land because you have to pay a consulting forester. You've got to have the forest management plan. The maps can, that all those things add up. But that might be another reason why folks might not want to enroll. In some parts of the state, the property tax savings may not be significant enough to make it worth enrolling in the property. The land use change tax is absolutely a penalty, like I said, and that can be a significant amount of money. And also there are property owners who, for whatever reason, don't want the state to have lien on their property. They don't want to have to follow a forest management plan and risk this land use change tax. The county foresters absolutely do inspections to make sure you do get a pretty significant penalty if you cut contrary, and you also cannot be back in the program for a period of time. And like I said, earlier, the agriculture, land and buildings does require the annual certification.
Reverend Nelson.
Chairman, if it's switched out of current use to be developed, how do you figure that? And it is a significant amount, but how do you figure it? Do you take it on a percentage of what the land sold to for development, or?
So if it's the whole parcel, if it's the whole piece that's got the land use change tax due, it's 10% of that fair market value. Whatever the lister has it set on the ground, that's 10%. If it's a portion of that, then the lister has to value that portion as if it's a standalone parcel, and it's 10% of that. So that was a change back in 2015 that the legislature made to make it a much higher penalty for sort of breaking off these little pieces, because a house site and a couple acres is much more, is taxed by acre at a much higher rate. So it's meant to sort of disincentivize breaking off pieces over time for development or whatever else is being used for. So that was a change in 2015 to have that. It used to be, it was prorated.
And then does that money get split up between the ed fund and the general fund, or does it all go to the
Yes.
general fund?
I've got a slide on that too. So the land use change tax that we collect, so it does come to the tax department, not to the town directly. Then the town gets 50% of that up to $2,000. And then
Okay, how much?
up to 2,000.
Okay.
So if we got $10,000 in land use change tax from a landowner, 2,000 of that goes to the lister, to the municipality. So it's 50% up to $2,000. And then the amount collected by the tax department is split between the ed fund and the general fund. I think it's 75-25% split. So we collect it and we remit it to the general fund and ed fund. It's not a lot of money, but it's, it's a few $1 million every year, I think. I think I might have a slide on that, but yeah, so it's, the tax department doesn't keep it. It goes to the municipality, the ed fund and the general fund.
Mhm.
Yeah, so like I said, I think it would be great for you folks to hear from FPR. They have a lot of really good information about this, but generally speaking, forest land is typically at least 25 acres. They're excluding any house site development, and having productive forest involved. They do have to have a forest management plan with maps. They also may not all be timber and productive forest. It might also be an ecologically significant treatment area. Vernal pools, wetlands, things like that. There's now reserved forest land. There is a map of significant wildlife habitats in Vermont that can also be included in the forest land enrollment. And some sensitive sites, again, definitely defer to FPR on these, because basically any application or enrollee goes through FPR review, and then once FPR is approved, then it comes to us. So at that point, we have faith that it's meeting the requirements because it's gone through FPR review. Also, qualified farmers can have forest land up to 25 acres of productive forest land can also be enrolled under their agriculture enrollment. And they can have unlimited non-productive forest. So there are a lot of examples of that too, right, where there's ag and forestry under the same enrollment. So for agricultural land enrollment, it has to be an active agriculture use. So pasturing livestock, growing crops and hay. There are, in the statute, it lists sort of examples of some of these, and the kinds of animals, the kinds of, vinous crops, things like that is all outlined. Cannabis is now in there as well. Qualified farmer has a specific definition where they make at least 50% of their gross annual income from the business of farming. So we do often look at income tax returns to make sure that someone is qualified. If it's less than 25 acres, they can also qualify if they earn at least $22,000 a year or more from the sale of farm crops. So those are things that we have to collect from folks to continue their enrollment and to enroll them in the program.
So, thank you, Chairman. So if someone has a 10-acre intense organic vegetable farm and they make $10,000 a year, they can enroll that in current use. They're not stuck to the 25 acre.
They can.
Okay,
They can.
that's great. Thank you.
You have, within city limits, there's some farms with current use.
Yes, we did work with BCGI to sort of map out the overlap of current use parcels and like downtowns and village centers and things like that. And there's a lot more closer to downtown than you might think. So development is either if you want to remove that lien from your property, or you have developed that parcel and therefore the land use change tax penalty is due. So landowners are allowed to have multiple dwellings on a 2-acre site. It used to be that you had to have 2 acres for each dwelling, right? Because that's sort of the house definition, in order to sort of encourage that cluster development. So a lot of these sort of changes over time have come about because we've had hearing officer decisions or situations that have gone, to court that we get a decision. It's like, okay, so that's how we're to interpret the law. So the sort of extreme example that I think of with this one a few years ago was someone had 10 small cabins that meant they had to remove 20 acres from enrollment, even though they were kind of in this little line of quarter of an acre. That felt like it was kind of an extreme requirement for, it wasn't really development of the 10 acres. So as of right now, you can, if you cluster them within that 2-acre site, you know, designed to have the lowest impact on the enrolled land and be able to keep more land enrolled.
Representative,
Chairman Clayton. What is the process for deciding something like that? Because it was decided within your department, or was it by the?
Yeah, so we had a hearing officer decision or a court decision that found that we should not do that. And so then the next year we went to the legislature and had the law change. So now it's in statute that it can have.
So it had to be done through the
Yeah.
legislature.
So development is also creating a parcel less than 25 acres, except when that's still eligible for enrollment and it was transferred to an immediate family member. So creating a parcel less than 25 acres happens, a lot, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. And unfortunately, what happens when you've got a parcel less than 25 acres that is agriculture eligible and you create 2 parcels from that, now you've created 2 parcels under 25 acres, so land use change taxes do one on both. But in essence, this is another reason why the land use change tax is designed to be, you know, a penalty to sort of prohibit breaking it into smaller parcels. There are examples of cut contraries. I think there was one in the news recently where a logger might have done something really out of whack with what the forest management plan was supposed to be. And so that caused a pretty significant hardship for that landowner. But there are inspections done by Forest Parks and Recreation to make sure that the forest management plan is being followed. If you construct any building, road, other structure, things like that on enrolled land, unless it's for farming or logging, right? So we see, you know, dirt bike tracks or water slides or a riding arena. There's lots of things folks do with their land that probably do have somewhat minimal impact, but those are considered developing because you're changing the property. We deal with a lot of questions about things like yurts or like temporary housing that's put on. And right, so if it's changing that underlying land in any way, if you're building a cement pad or something, that's development. If you're pitching a tent and you move it every week, that's not development. But there are a lot of examples of that coming up too, of what constitutes a development, what constitutes a dwelling.
Representative O'Brien.
What about solar fields with potentially you could still graze underneath?
Yeah, so there are allowances for solar. There's a lot of examples of that. If the concentration of animals using the land underneath is still like sheep grazing under, that can be eligible. And then there's also, I believe, there is also a treatment for solar properties that they're taxed as if the solar is not there. So it's not like it has added huge value to the property as well. And also there's examples where people all solar to power their milk farmers, right? So it can be incorporated. But if it's purely a solar field with no underlying agriculture use, then it needs to come out of the program. There is also considered development if there's a water quality violation by Agency of Agriculture. I haven't been aware of that in the few years I've been director. I think Ag probably works closely with farmers to try to mitigate that from getting to that point, but so I don't have any recent examples of that, but as definitely considered development under the statute, and that would be removed from the program. All right, so here's where it gets really fun. So as we talked about, so the development is if you meet those categories of development or you want the link code, but what we have a lot of and why we're tracking these sort of layers of parcels and maps over time is that the land use change tax is calculated when the land is removed from the program. It is not necessarily always owed at that time. You can withdraw from the program, the land use change tax is calculated, the lien and that bill are sitting on the property, but it's not accruing interest or anything like that. And then you're paying full fair market value on your property taxes going forward. So if you're okay with the lien on it, then that lien will stay on there and the land use change tax will be sitting there and ready. So what that means is we're tracking a lot of withdrawn but not developed land that's not in the program anymore, but still very much has that lien on it. And if I sell my property to someone else and that lien is still on there, like I said, that follows that property and that land use change tax calculation follows that property as well. So we definitely have folks who are interested in property or who are, going through some sort of property transaction, calling to find out, is the land use change tax due? What is it? Which is completely fair. We can tell them that if it's been calculated already.
What would be the advantage of withdrawing without developing?
Well, it may not be that you're developed, but you may not be eligible for current use anymore. You may be, maybe you want to withdraw forest land, but you don't want to manage it anymore, but you haven't developed it. You just sort of let it be. Or maybe the literal land has not changed in any way, but the ownership has changed. So it might be someone who's a farmer who's no longer a farmer, so they're not qualified under that. So it's withdrawn. The people who own it now are not getting the property tax benefits. They're paying full farm market value, but the lien has not been removed.
You're working your way through Act 250. I could see it might take 3 years or something.
Right, yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, an example. Block of land. Owned by a farmer, had a lien on it. The farmer sold the block of land. It's sitting there, undeveloped. I believe they've removed it from the program, so they don't have to pay the penalty if they haven't developed it, correct?
Right, and that can include, but development includes if it's under 25 acres.
Yeah, it's a significant block. I'd love to farm it, but how long does that penalty follow that land? Does it follow it in perpetuity, or if they pay the going rate of school and municipality tax, does it drop the penalty?
No, it just stays right what it was at the time of development over time. The only change is when it's calculated, it also has the CLA applied to it. So that's that factor applied to your tax rate, basically to adjust for what property values are doing. So that is applied to that value too, but it stays that figure and it follows that land. We have some that we have tracked back into the 80s and 90s, but the dollar figure doesn't change.
So the dollar figure doesn't change.
Nope.
So if they bought the land and at the time, this is all hypothetical, if the land was worth $10,000 an acre for development when they bought it, and it goes up to being worth $15,000 an acre, the penalty's still on the 10?
Yep, it's set at that moment, it's pulled out of the program. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. That's a really important distinction. I'm glad you mentioned that. And some states do, instead of having the penalty calculated this way, it might be based on how much, sort of 5 years back of savings, or it might be 10 years and then it's done. There's different ways that folks have this calculation, but that's how it is in Vermont. Sort of at that point in time, the lister makes that, or assessor makes that valuation, and that's the land use change tax. And
it's 10%.
It will accrue penalty and interest if it's developed, right? So if it is developed and it hasn't been paid, then that will definitely accrue, and that can add up. The penalty and interest can add up over time. But if it's not developed, it sits there and follows the land.
Heather, if you ever win Mega Millions, I got the place for you to set up. It's 25 acres of beautiful sandy loam soil.
Noted.
Yeah, no, it's right on the edge of Newport in Derby. It would be perfect for what you're looking for.
So this is just sort of the over time, and obviously, like I said, in 2015, so it went into effect basically 2016, 2017, the land use change tax changed a bit, the methodology. That's when it started to be that split between the state and the municipality, and it became, if it's a portion of the parcel, it's valued as a standalone parcel. So, these numbers aren't necessarily as indicative of much compared to some other long-term taxation things, because land use change tax it's very different depending on the year. It's maybe some years there's a lot of penalty and some years there's not. There might be towns that go years without having any land use change tax. So a lot of times towns will be like, why did you guys just send me $2,000 and $15 for the lien release? Because they haven't seen that in 10 years. But this is just the picture of what has been assessed. The 50% up to $2,000 that the municipalities have been paid out. And then you can sort of look at the acreage. Again, it hasn't necessarily changed things drastically one way or the other. You look back in earlier years, I think, when this statutory change happened, which was when I was still Agency of Education, so I was not here at tax, there was something called the easy out. So because the penalty was going up significantly, there was a window of time where folks could do an easy out and come out of the program prior to this higher penalty being in place. And so that was a busy year for current use folks. So yeah, this is just sort of the picture over time of that change. And like I said, this isn't indicative of anything one way or the other, because it's just completely what happens to have happened that year. It's not going up or down, nor should it, because it's a penalty. It's not meant to like change over time one way or the other. But boring stuff, but this is important to us. We have anyone who's worked with our program knows that we are still dealing with paper maps. We have files and files and files of paper maps going back to the 80s, and we still have to collect paper maps for our review. We still have a light table in our office next door that we are using to compare maps over time. So FPR is a little ahead of us. So they are actually building a system that will allow us to share maps digitally, because pretty much you definitely can still hand draw your own maps. That is definitely allowed if it meets the mapping standards, which are on our website and FPR's website. But generally speaking, especially for forest land, you've got a professional GIS person making you a map, or you can do them yourself on the A&R Atlas. People do that as well, but it exists electronically. So it makes sense for us to be able to have those electronically and not require paper maps anymore. So we're excited about that. And also it will help with some of the manual processes we have. Like I said, every year we're kind of trying to improve that point of property transfer tax return, property that's enrolled in current use, to make sure the landowner knows what they just bought and what their responsibility is, and to allow us to keep track of ownership. But there's also a requirement that folks are in good standing with the tax department to be eligible. So once we move everything into VTax, which is the system that the whole rest of the tax department uses, it can check that for us. But right now we have an employee who does that on top of his regular work. It's just checks good standing. I think that is the end of my PowerPoint, but I'm happy to answer any other questions.
Right. Has there ever been a case where the Agency of Ag says this land that's in current use can't be farmed anymore? I mean, I was just thinking of, say, there was a 100-acre field that was testing so high for PFOAs that you couldn't farm it anymore, and then what would happen to that ag designation?
Yeah, we don't get that from Agency of Ag. What we have a lot lately, unfortunately, is flooded land that's now contaminated, so it's not eligible.
Right, that is familiar.
So there are provisions in statute that if there's like a natural disaster or something, then we won't hold them to, if you can't farm that land, and you need the soil to recover, or there's contaminants, that we're not considering that development, right? We're gonna leave it in, they're leaving it eligible because that was completely out of their control.
So like post Irene, all that farmland remained.
Yeah, and last year that happened to a lot of farms. Yeah. So there was some concern, because these are very honest people saying, I can't sign this ag certification saying that I farmed and got a crop because it's gone, right? So we had to make that really clear that we were not, that they were still enrolled.
Or if all the topsoil went away, what would happen then? It essentially was unfarmable. It would still be considered ag land?
I mean, the big flood in 2023, yeah, at this point, but we've sent out the latest ag certifications, right? There are folks that might have to come out of the program, but the value of that property is so nil that theoretically the land use change tax wouldn't be much, but we don't have the authority to like abate it for that. But we're also, like I said, there's language in statute that if there's some sort of provision, natural disaster or something, then they can stay in the program at least for the time being.
Makes me think about ag land that's not maintained, so it's not cut or not tilled, and just devolves back into eventually into forest land. How is that treated?
There is, you can enroll what's called open idle under the forestry category. It can't be its own thing. It has to be part of an enrolled forest land parcel, but you can have a portion of your enrollment be open idle, where it's just
if you have a large enough parcel.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Representative Bosson.
Yeah, I just have a clarification question. So what you just talked about in terms of if you have flooded land, did you say that the farmers then would not pay tax on the damaged land at all, or they just wouldn't have to pay the higher rate because of coming out of current use if they didn't farm it that year? Like, do they basically get a forgiveness that year because of the damage, or do they just stay at the lower rate?
Yeah, if they are finding that they are not going to be able to farm it, like
Yeah.
it's not gonna be eligible, then they are no longer eligible and need to come out of the program. But that, the land use change tax would be calculated on the value of what that land is. And so the lister should be making that determination that this is, ruined and flooded and doesn't have any value. And so that would be 10% of that fair market value, which should be pretty low. Yeah, it's tricky. It's been tough to kind of try to buy time to figure out what to do with these because it's through zero fault of theirs and they very much would like to farm it. And in some, they're keeping in communication with us that like, it's gonna take 2 years, but then we are absolutely gonna aerate the soil and put new soil and build it back up. So it's sort of a case by case thing, but yeah, if they're like, if this is done, I'm not gonna be able to farm this anymore,
Mhm.
then it does have to come out of the program. But hopefully, the lister or assessor would value it as what it is, which is pretty low value, and then that would be 10% of that. And they can appeal that. They can appeal that to us.
Just a question about the payment that goes to municipalities that's capped at $2,000 when there's disenrollment. What's the rationale for that since they're held harmless?
Yeah, it's to pay for the lister and assessor to do the land use change tax calculation.
Exactly.
I mean, again, that was before my time, but that's my understanding. It's kind of like they are having to do an additional valuation. They get per parcel payments from us every year now for helping us with brandless maintenance, the equalization study, all the other things that listers and assessors are doing for the statewide education property tax. So this was adding some work on their plate. And so I'm sure at the time they said, can we get some of the land use change tax collected because it is work on our office.
You mentioned pluses and minuses of enrolling early, and you had slides showing what those were. Does your department have the capacity, or is it charged with helping to provide guidance, technical assistance to people who think maybe I would like to enroll, but I'm not sure if it's a good idea because of these possible?
Yeah, so broadly speaking, just from like how tax departments need to operate, we are not allowed to give tax advice or recommend practitioners. But we can certainly say, we can walk through the eligibility requirements. We can make it really clear what the land use change tax is and what examples of that would be. So we do try to answer those questions because the unfortunate thing that still happens sometimes is the land use change tax might become due because someone made a real estate transaction and it completely is not at all what they meant to do or what the impact is not worth it. And so they're like, whoa, I want to back all of this stuff back out. I want to negate that removal. I want to put that back in. Never mind. I'm not going to break this up. So ideally they would have all of that information before they make that decision. But we can give some, just here's the statute, here's the administrative rules, here's examples of that, here's why you would or would not qualify. And then I think there are definitely still some town listers and assessors who can also give folks that information too. Like, here's where your property tax bill is now. Here's what it would be under current use. We also have a calculator on our website so people can kind of figure that out because the savings, might not be worth it. So the more information we give people before they make a decision, but we are allowed to broadly explain the impacts. Yes.
Representative O'Brien.
Has there been any tension on the maple sugaring side because it's considered ag by the Agency of Ag, and so per acre, right, it would get a much different valuation if it was considered, this forest was a sugar bush as opposed to just a forest.
Yeah, and sugar bush can actually be enrolled in either category. It can be considered as agriculture as well as forest. So FPR did a whole sort of report and study about sugar because do you do it like by count of taps and things like that. But yeah, it certainly can be very valuable, and it's an annual crop because of how maple sugaring works. But yeah,
So it's really up to the landowner.
You can do either. I have some enrolled in ag and forest land, depending on the situation.
Other questions?
Could I just offer clarification on the cannabis? In 2023, you changed it from they had to be previously enrolled. Now, any outdoor cultivator, regardless of size, is eligible. So they just had to be outdoor and then they had to qualify for. It used to be you had to be small. It used to be you had to be previously enrolled. That changed in 2020.
Like, are indoor grows considered ag buildings?
Indoor is not eligible. And that's the dynamic between different chairs. One chair believes that indoor is just an energy suck and should not be getting benefits.
This has evolved rapidly, right? Because 4 years ago, there was we didn't have legalized cannabis retail. I just wanted to ask about if we know anything, or if your department would be tracking how much enrolled land is also conserved, permanently conserved.
gosh, we should. I think Forest Parks and Recreation does have that captured. I'm not sure if we have the data sophistication to pull that out, but I bet we can figure that out. And just where I sit, just like anecdotally, I have to approve all of those. It's Title 10 is what we call it. So in Title 10, if you're a conservation, you meet these certain criteria, then you can be enrolled. Dozens every year. So there's a lot.
Yeah.
But I should try to find that. I think that would be handy for us to have, yeah.
Right. Well, if there are any other questions or any other comments that I want to share, we can let Jill. So thank you very much for presentation. Very helpful.
Yeah.
And I'll follow up.
Very helpful.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah, and if you can email us if you've got other things, and if there's more information that you want to share in person, we can have you back.
Okay, great. Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, any other thoughts from the committee before we take a break? All right.